"You can sleep in the garage tonight, old man. The guest room's taken." My grandson said that to me. Wesley, 7 years old. He repeated it like a parrot, word for word, looking up at me with those big eyes while his father stood behind him in the kitchen doorway with a smirk I'll never forget, as long as I live. And the worst part? It was my garage, my kitchen, my house. The house I'd paid off 31 years ago with my own 2 hands. I'm Calvin. I'm 68 years old, a retired structural welder out of Toledo, Ohio. Before I tell you how I took apart my son-in-law's entire life one bolt at a time, do me a favor and let me know down in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you believe that people who mistake a man's patience for weakness deserve to find out exactly how wrong they are, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this story doesn't end the way that smug man thought it would. It was the Sunday before Thanksgiving. I'd spent the whole afternoon in the kitchen browning a turkey breast and getting the stuffing going early, because my late wife Ruth always said the flavor needs 2 days to settle into the bird. Ruth passed 4 winters ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and cruel. And ever since, I'd kept her recipes taped inside the cabinet door, splattered and yellowed, because following them made me feel like she was still standing at my shoulder telling me I was using too much sage. I had the radio on. I was happy, if you can believe that. My daughter Brooke and her husband had been living with me for almost 3 years by then, and I'd told myself it was a blessing. A full house again. Noise in the hallways. A little boy's sneakers by the door. What I hadn't let myself see was how much it had cost me. When Brooke first asked if they could move in, it was supposed to be 6 months, just until they got back on their feet. Her husband, Trent, had gotten laid off from some sales job, and they were drowning. I said, of course. What kind of father wouldn't? I cleared out the 2 upstairs bedrooms, bought a bigger water heater so nobody fought over hot showers, and I told them not to worry about rent while they sorted things out. 3 years later, I was still paying the property taxes, the utilities, the groceries, the homeowner's insurance, and most of Wesley's school supplies, and Trent had a new job he bragged about constantly, but somehow never had a dollar to put toward the house he was living in for free. I told myself I didn't mind. I had my pension and a little put away. And I loved having Wesley around, even when he started talking to me in a tone he could only have learned from his father. So that Sunday, when I carried the turkey breast out to rest on the counter and heard Trent on the phone in the living room, I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't anything. I was just a tired old man wiping his hands on a dish towel. Then I heard him say my name. No, the old man's house is basically already ours, Trent said, laughing low like it was the funniest thing in the world. 3 bedrooms, big lot, paid off. We just gotta wait him out. Honestly, with how slow he's moving lately, might not be long. I stood in the doorway with that dish towel in my hands, and I didn't make a sound. He had his back to me. He never even knew I was there. He thought I was still fussing over the turkey. Wait him out. I want to tell you that I felt rage right then, but I didn't. Not yet. What I felt was something colder. A kind of quiet click, like a breaker switching off somewhere deep inside me. I'd spent 40 years welding the bones of buildings together. I knew the exact sound a structure makes right before it fails, and standing in that doorway, I heard it in my own family. I went back into the kitchen. I finished resting the turkey. I covered it with foil. And I started, very calmly, to pay attention. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I logged into my bank account. Not the checking I used for groceries. The savings. The account I'd promised Ruth on her deathbed I would never touch except for one thing. There was $41,000 in there, set aside for exactly one purpose, a college fund for Wesley, so that boy would never have to start his life buried in debt the way kids do now. Ruth made me swear it. It was the last promise I made to her, holding her hand in that hospice bed. The balance read $212. I sat there at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, while the coffee went cold. I thought it was a glitch. I thought maybe I'd opened the wrong account. I refreshed it 3 times. I even called the bank's automated line and punched in my numbers and listened to a computer voice tell me the same thing. $212? I pulled up the transaction history with my hands not quite steady. Over the past 14 months, there had been withdrawals. Small ones at first. 200 here, 500 there. Then bigger. A few thousand at a time. All transfers, all to the same external account I didn't recognize. Whoever set this up had been patient, careful. They'd kept each one small enough that the automated fraud alerts never tripped. They knew I almost never looked at that account because looking at it hurt. It was Ruth's account, in my mind, and opening it was like opening her closet. Someone had been bleeding my dead wife's promise dry for over a year. Now here's the thing. The man who did this didn't understand about me. He saw a slow old welder who shuffled a little and forgot where he put his reading glasses. He didn't see that for 40 years my job was to find the one weak weld in a structure that looked perfectly solid to everyone else. That's what I did. I found the failure before it killed somebody, and I was very, very good at it. I didn't say a word to anybody. Not to Brooke, not to Trent. I made my breakfast. I told them I was driving to the hardware store, and instead I drove to see the one man in this world I trusted completely. His name is Desmond, and he was my best friend for 35 years before he became anything else. We met on a job site when we were both young and stupid, and we'd buried both our wives within 2 years of each other. The difference between us was that after Desmond's wife died, he went back to school at 51 and became a forensic accountant. Now he spent his days untangling exactly the kind of quiet, patient theft that someone had just done to me. I sat in his cramped little office that smelled like old coffee and printer toner, and I laid it all out. The phone call I overheard. The empty account. The 14 months of withdrawals. Desmond listened without saying a word, the way he always did, just nodding slow and writing things down on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he didn't tell me he was sorry. He didn't reach across the desk and pat my hand. He just looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, "Calvin, a man doesn't drain $41,000 out of a savings account he has no name on. Not without paperwork. Somewhere, there's a document that gave him the keys. We find that document, we've got him." And then he turned to his computer and started typing, and I watched my oldest friend turn into something with teeth. It took him 2 days. 2 days of phone calls and database searches and favors called in from people who owed him. And on the third morning, he called me and told me to come down to the office and to sit down before he showed me what he found. There was a document filed at the Lucas County Recorder's office, dated 9 months earlier, a quitclaim deed. On it, in handwriting that looked almost exactly like mine. Almost, but not quite, because the man who forged it didn't know I always looped my capital C backward, a habit from my apprenticeship. I had supposedly signed over a 60% ownership stake in my house to my daughter and her husband as joint tenants. I had never seen that document before in my life. Desmond scrolled down and showed me the notary stamp at the bottom. A woman named down at a check cashing place over on the east side. The kind of operation that'll stamp anything for $40 and ask no questions. He'd already pulled her record. She'd been cited twice for improper notarization. Trent hadn't just stolen from me. He'd manufactured a legal claim to my home, the home Ruth and I bought when Brooke was still in diapers, and he'd had a crook with a rubber stamp make it look real. But Desmond wasn't done. He pulled up one more thing, and this is where my blood truly went cold. There was a pending transaction. A home equity line of credit applied for just 11 days ago against my house, using that forged 60% stake as collateral. The application was for $90,000. It hadn't closed yet. These things take a few weeks to process, but it was scheduled to fund on the Friday after Thanksgiving. Trent wasn't waiting me out. He was strip mining everything I had, and once that loan funded, he'd have $90,000 of debt hung around my house's neck. Debt I'd be legally tangled in for years, and a paper trail that made it look like I'd agreed to every bit of it. Desmond leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said the thing I already knew he was going to say. "We go to the police right now, Calvin, and you know what happens." He lawyers up. "He says you signed it. You're just confused. Your memory's going. Your own daughter might back him up. The DA looks at a messy family's squabble over a house and offers him a plea, and he walks with probation and a stern look, That what you want?" It was not what I wanted. What I wanted was for Trent to keep walking confidently toward the edge of the cliff he'd built himself, all the way to the very end, where there was no walking it back. I wanted him to commit a crime so big and so federal that no smooth talk and no rubber-stamped notary could save him. So I told Desmond my idea, and for the first time in this whole nightmare, my old friend smiled. Here's what most people don't know. The moment you submit a loan application backed by a forged ownership document, you've committed forgery. But the moment that loan actually funds, the moment a federally insured bank wires money based on those fraudulent papers, it becomes bank fraud, federal bank fraud, the kind the FBI handles, the kind that doesn't get plea bargain down to a slap on the wrist, the kind that comes with mandatory minimums measured in years. Trent had set the funding date himself, the Friday after Thanksgiving. All I had to do was let him keep believing he'd won, right up until the trap closed. But Desmond made one thing very clear. We had to protect me legally before any of it funded. So that same afternoon, he drew up a document of my own, a sworn, notarized affidavit of forgery, filed directly with the county and the bank's fraud department, stating in plain language that the quitclaim deed bearing my name was a forgery, that I had granted no one authority over my property, and that I was of completely sound mind. He had me examined by a physician that very week, a thorough cognitive evaluation, all documented, all signed and dated, because Desmond knew the first thing Trent would reach for when cornered was the word dementia, and we were going to take that weapon out of his hands before he ever knew he needed it. We filed everything quietly. No notification to Trent. The forged deed was now legally dead, but only in the county and bank records. To Trent, everything still looked golden. He'd walk into that bank on Friday thinking he was about to collect $90,000, and instead he'd be walking onto a tripwire wired straight to the federal building downtown. Then I drove home and did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I walked back into that house and pretended to be a beaten old man. Thanksgiving was 4 days away. For 4 days, I had to sit across the dinner table from the man who had robbed my dead wife's memory and smile and pass the potatoes. Trent made it easy to hate him. That week, he got bolder than he'd ever been. He started talking about renovations he wanted to do, knocking out a wall, finishing the basement. He talked about it right in front of me, like I was a piece of furniture that came with the house. One night at dinner, he told Brooke, loud enough for me to hear, that they should look into getting Dad set up somewhere with more support. A facility. He said the word like he was doing me a kindness. He even mentioned one by name, some place out past the county line, and described how they keep an eye on the residents around the clock. Isn't that nice, Dad? Wouldn't that be nice? I just nodded and said it sounded like something to think about. And I watched the satisfaction spread across his face, because he thought he'd broken me. But it was my daughter who put the real crack in my heart. Wednesday night, the night before Thanksgiving, I came downstairs for a glass of water and found Brooke alone in the kitchen. She'd been crying. For one foolish second, my heart leapt, because I thought maybe she knew. Maybe she'd found out what Trent was doing and she was sick over it. Maybe my little girl was still in there. She grabbed my arm and she begged me. She said, Dad, please, whatever Trent asks you to do these next few days, just do it. Don't fight him. He's working on something big for us, something that's finally going to fix everything, and if you make trouble now, you could ruin it. She said their marriage was hanging by a thread, and this was the thing that was going to save it. She looked me in the eye and asked me to please just cooperate. She knew. Maybe not the forged deed. Maybe not every detail. But she knew Trent was reaching into my life and pulling out money, and she decided that her crumbling marriage was worth more than her father's dignity. She decided I was a resource to be spent. I looked at the girl I taught to ride a bike on Calvert Street, the girl whose scraped knees I cleaned, whose college I paid for, and I felt the last warm thing inside me go quiet. I told her I understood. I told her not to worry. And I went back upstairs and I lay in the dark, and I did not sleep. And somewhere in those long hours, the last of my mercy for the two of them burned down to nothing. Thanksgiving morning, the house smelled like Ruth's kitchen used to. I'd gotten up at 5 and done all the cooking myself, the way I had every year since she passed. Around noon, Trent's parents arrived, and his brother and a couple of their friends I'd never met, and they all came into my house like they owned it, tracking snow across Ruth's floors, helping themselves to my liquor cabinet, laughing too loud. When I came out of the kitchen carrying the turkey, the dining room table was full. Every chair. And the chair at the head of the table, my chair, the one I'd sat in for 31 years, had Trent's father in it. There was no place set for me. Trent saw me standing there holding the turkey, and instead of getting up, instead of making room, he just looked at me and said, "Why don't you eat in the kitchen, Dad? Grown-up table's kind of full." And little Wesley, my grandson, my Ruthie's grandson, piped up with that line he'd clearly heard at home. "Yeah, you can sleep in the garage." The whole table laughed. I didn't. I set the turkey down on the sideboard very gently, the way you set down something that matters. I looked at every face at that table, one by one. Brooke wouldn't meet my eyes. And then I did exactly what they expected of a broken old man. I left. I got my coat and I walked out the front door into the cold, and I heard them laughing behind me, and I drove to a diner on Monroe Street, and I sat in a booth and drank coffee and let them have their feast. Let them think they'd won. Friday was coming. I'll be honest with you. Sitting in that diner was the lowest I'd felt since the day Ruth died. Because part of me still wished it weren't true. Part of me wanted to be wrong about my own little girl. But I wasn't wrong. And a man can grieve and prepare for war at the same time. I've learned that now. Friday morning came gray and cold. Desmond picked me up at 8. We didn't go to the bank where Trent's loan was funding. We didn't need to be there. We went downtown, to a federal building, to an office where 2 people were waiting for us, a woman from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit named Agent Okonkwo, and an investigator from the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Fraud Division. They'd been briefed. Desmond had spent the week building the file, and it was airtight. The forged deed, the notary's record, the bank withdrawals, my affidavit, my clean cognitive evaluation, all of it. At 10:14 that morning, Agent Okonkwo got a call. She listened, said confirmed, and hung up. The loan had funded. $90,000 had just been wired into an account, based on documents the bank had now flagged as fraudulent, across state lines, from a federally insured institution. Trent had pulled the trigger himself. He just didn't know the gun was pointed at him. I didn't go home right away. I sat in that federal office and gave my statement, slow and clear, every detail, while a stenographer typed. And when I finally did drive home that afternoon, there was an unmarked car already parked across the street from my house. I walked in the front door. Brooke was in the living room. Trent was pacing with his phone to his ear, and his face was the color of old paper. The bank had called him. Something about a hold, a flag, a fraud investigation. He was shouting at whoever was on the line. He saw me come in, and he didn't even bother to hide it anymore. "What did you do?" he said, low and shaking. "What did you do, old man?" I didn't answer him. I just sat down in my chair, the one his father had sat in 2 days before, and I waited. It didn't take long. The knock on the door came about 20 minutes later. Agent Okonkwo and 2 other agents, badges out, calm as Sunday morning. I watched my son-in-law's whole body go loose when he understood. I watched him try to laugh it off, try to say there'd been a misunderstanding, a family thing. His father-in-law was confused. His memory wasn't good. And I watched Agent Okonkwo set my notarized cognitive evaluation on the table in front of him, dated and signed by a physician, and I watched the last of his story die in his throat. He turned on Brooke before they even got the cuffs on him, pointed right at her and said it was all her idea. She'd planned the whole thing. She made him do it. His own wife. He threw her to them without a second's hesitation, and I saw something break in my daughter's face that I think will never fully heal. The moment she finally understood exactly what she'd tied her life to. They took him out the front door in handcuffs, past Ruth's flower beds, into the back of that unmarked car. Wesley was upstairs. He didn't see it. I made sure of that because whatever his father is, that boy is still Ruth's blood, and he didn't choose any of this. Brooke crumpled onto the couch and sobbed and asked me how I could let this happen, how I could do this to her family. And I sat there and I told her the truth, quiet and steady. I told her I didn't do this. Trent did this. The day he decided my home and my dead wife's promise were just sitting there for the taking. I told her I'd heard her in the kitchen Wednesday night. I told her I knew she knew. She didn't have anything to say to that. I gave her until the first of the year to find a place. I'm not a cruel man, and she's still my daughter, and she'll have to live the rest of her life knowing what she chose. That's punishment enough. I don't need to add to it. But she couldn't stand under my roof. Not after that. The $41,000, most of it was recovered, frozen in the account Trent had funneled it into, returned to me over the following months through the courts. The very first thing I did was put it somewhere he could never reach it again, even from a prison phone, an irrevocable trust in Wesley's name, locked down tight, that boy's college, and not 1 cent for anybody else, administered by a bank, payable to him and him alone when he's grown. Ruth's promise, kept. It just took a longer road than I ever imagined. Trent took a plea in the end. Bank fraud, forgery, theft from an elder. The federal charge carried the weight. He's looking at the better part of a decade before he sees the outside again. He sends letters. I don't open them. It's spring now as I tell you this. The house is quiet in a way it hasn't been in years, and I've made my peace with the quiet. Wesley comes every other weekend. Brooke and I work that out, because a boy needs his grandfather, and I will not let her bad marriage cost him that. We bake from Ruth's recipes. He's getting tall. I sat at the head of my own table last Sunday in my own chair in the house I built my life in, and I ate a meal I cooked with my own hands in a kitchen that's finally mine again. Nobody told me to eat in the garage. I spent most of my life believing that family meant you swallowed your pride and you gave and you gave and you never asked what it cost you. That keeping the peace was the same as keeping the love. I don't believe that anymore. Love that only flows one direction isn't love. It's just somebody emptying you out, dollar by dollar, until there's nothing left. Real family doesn't wait you out. Real family doesn't make you small in your own home. And the day you find the courage to stop letting them, even if their name is on your child's birth certificate, that's the day you finally get your life back. I got mine back. It only cost me everything I thought a father was supposed to give, and I'd do it again tomorrow. For 3 years, I told myself that paying every bill and asking for nothing was what love looked like. I was wrong, and it nearly cost me my home and the last promise I ever made to Ruth. Trent didn't take my house because he was clever. He took it because I handed him 3 years of silence and called it patience. That's the first thing I had to face when this was over, that my own quiet had been part of the machine that almost ground me down. Here's what I've come to understand about how it all unraveled the way it did. Trent counted on me being too soft to look closely and too proud to ask for help, and for 14 months he was right. Every withdrawal he made was a bet that I'd keep my eyes shut. What he never figured into his math was that a man can change. The day I heard him laughing in my living room about waiting me out, I stopped being the man he'd built his plan around. Cause and effect. He pulled, and eventually the rope he was pulling on was tied to a trap. If I could put one thing in your hands tonight, it would be the understanding that surviving people like Trent takes 3 things working together, and you can't skip any of them. The first is knowing right from wrong and refusing to let someone talk you out of it. When Brooke begged me in that kitchen to just cooperate, every soft part of me wanted to, and saying no to my own crying daughter was the hardest decent thing I've ever done. The second is using your head instead of your temper. I wanted to throw that turkey across the room. Instead, I called Desmond. I built a file. I let the law do what my anger never could. A loud man would have gone to the police that first night and watched Trent walk free. A thinking man waits for the trap to close on its own. And the third is the plain stubbornness to see it through when every day hurts. Sitting across that Thanksgiving table from a man I despised, passing him the potatoes, smiling. That took a kind of endurance I didn't know I had left at 68. There were nights I lay in the dark and wanted to quit, to just sign whatever they wanted and disappear into that facility he'd picked out. I didn't. I got up the next morning and kept building. You don't get your life back by being the nicest person at the table. You get it back by being good when it's hard, smart when you're furious, and unbreakable when you're tired. I learned that too late to save myself the heartbreak, but not too late to save Wesley's future or to sit at the head of my own table again. If you take nothing else from an old welder, take that.